Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session with Dr. David Cooper of the U.S. Naval War College, where he'll discuss his new book, Arms Control for the Third Nuclear Age, Between Disarmament and Armageddon. But before turning to David, let me just make a few words to help set the context for you. 3 years ago, we at CGSR ran a workshop on the future of U.S.-Russian arms control. And among the principal conclusions were that we're still trying to sort out precisely what the objectives of arms control are or should be in the new era. We knew what they were in the Cold War era, which is to say the principal roles of arms control were to reduce the risk of war, to reduce the cost of war if it occurred, and to reduce the cost of preparing for war. Some people treat these as enduring functions of arms control. The sense of the room in the summer of 2018 was that in the new security environment marked by a renewal of rivalry, but in a tripolar way, arms control should have a role to play in moderating competitive pressures and managing competitive risks. In an environment marked by uncertainty, it should have a role in bringing predictability. And in a period marked by nuclear modernization by all three, it should facilitate transparency. We went on 3 years ago to lament the absence of much new thinking about the relationship between arms control and strategic competition. We found some instincts among our group. One instinct was arms control as a mean to channel that competition so as to reduce its costs and risks. Others saw it as an opportunity to channel that competition so as to secure unilateral U.S. advantages, a very different objective. So happily, some good new work has been done to develop new concepts related to the relationship between the dominant characteristics of the security environment we now live in, with its much more competitive and uncertain quality, and the roles and functions possibly of arms control measures. And some of the best of that work has been done by our speaker today, Dr. David Cooper. David is the James Forrestal Professor at the U.S. Naval War College, where he previously served as chair of the Department of National Security Affairs. He's a scholar practitioner, which means he's balanced a career in academia with a career in government. He's a former member of the Senior Executive Service. We first met nearly 2 decades ago when he was serving in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in a role as Director of Nonproliferation Policy and Director of Strategic Arms Control Policy. David holds a PhD in Political Science and International Relations from the Australian National University and is a graduate of Columbia University and Oberlin College. Before turning to David, let me remind you all of the ground rules. David will speak for 30 to 45 minutes. Then we'll turn to discussion with the group, which will be, of course, off the record. And at that point, I'll call on people who have raised their hands electronically. If you'd rather submit a question through the chat function, that's fine. Please make sure you send it my way and not just somewhere off into cyberspace. With that, let me thank David for his time and effort on our behalf to bring his ideas from his new book to this community. Pleasure to welcome you to the laboratory today. Over to you. David, sorry, we missed the first few words. You just popped on.
That's okay. I was thanking you, so it wasn't important.
Ah, well, there we go.
In all seriousness, thank you for having me here today to talk about the book, which actually technically comes out on Friday. So this really is an opportunity to talk about it hot off the press. I only wish I was there in Livermore, where I could go out for a glass of wine and lunch at one of your beautiful wineries afterwards. But of course, we're in the virtual world now, and there's something to be said for that. So as Brad said, my new book, Arms Control for the Third Nuclear Age. I'm not going to try to summarize the entire book in 30 minutes, but what I will do is try to hit on some key themes and hopefully throw out some provocations that will get some good questions and discussions going. I would note the tiny little obligatory disclaimer at the bottom, but stress that all views are my own and not those of the U.S. government or indeed any other organization. Katie, could you go to the next slide? So I'm not going to try to summarize the book, but let me at least give you a sense of the order of the book, because I'm going to hit large themes in a somewhat scattershot way this morning to try to keep my comments within about a half hour. So the book opens looking at where we're going in terms of the nuclear landscape and in the context of the larger geostrategic and geopolitical transformation that is going on within the international system, often shorthanded as the rise of great power competition, or more accurately, the return of great power competition. Then we turn to the Cold War and the theorizing that led to arms control as a distinct paradigm. This was an academic paradigm that then migrated to government, which is somewhat unusual. It was created sort of whole cloth as an academic paradigm. Some key seminal works, The Control of the Arms Race by Hedley Bull, Strategy and Arms Control by Thomas Schelling and Mort Halpern. And indeed, it's one of the rare cases where an academic paradigm really did migrate whole cloth and become strategic orthodoxy for the United States, with some of the various theorists who came up with it following it into government, Paul Nitze, Henry Kissinger, and others. That provides a sort of opportunity to kind of understand where this came from at the time in the Cold War, and in particular, we now talk about arms control and disarmament almost indistinguishably, but at the time, arms control was the new thing. And the new arms controllers took great pains to distinguish it from disarmament, not just in a sort of technical way that we might today. Arms control is anything that governs or manages armed forces, whereas disarmament is the reduction or elimination. But really in terms of the basic premises. Disarmament flowed from the premise that the source of international tensions, the source of war, in fact, were weapons. And this was a concept coming out of World War I, where the belief was that the arms racing and competition leading into World War I was, in fact, a proximate cause. Arms control really reflects the rethinking from the World War II experience and the birth of classical realism, which looked at the weapons themselves as not being the core source of international tensions, but as politics and tensions of a political nature. And therefore, the new arms controllers had very little sense that achieving drastic reductions or even the elimination of nuclear weapons would be feasible. But even if it would, it might not even be desirable. And so what the new arms control paradigm was all about, as Brad indicated, was looking at managing competition in the nuclear shadow. And in effect, what they were trying to do was figure out how to prevent nuclear war, the ultimate catastrophe. And where they came out, of course, boils down to mutual deterrence, stable mutual deterrence. So in that sense, disarmament was really seen as an alternative to military security, whereas arms control was really seen as an adjunct or even a part of military security. with a deterrence orthodoxy growing up, together with arms control basically being in the service of deterrence. It's been said that arms control was all about making the world safe for nuclear deterrence. And again, here again, a lot of cross-fertilization. Thomas Schelling, one of the founding arms control theorists, was also one of the great deterrence theorists. And we still talk about the Schelling-Kahn tensions in terms of our deterrence approach. Then I go on and I look at the actual negotiating experience, trying to extrapolate lessons from the Cold War negotiating experience that might be applicable for today's tripolar, multipolar environment. Then I go and I look at the transition away from the arms control paradigm and towards what I call a denuclearization paradigm. And I'll speak more on that in a moment. That happened after the Cold War for very obvious and sensible reasons. And then in the final chapter, I try to look and apply all these lessons and basically run down some principles that we can take away from the Cold War experience, both in theory and practice, and from that extrapolate some specific proposals. If you could take that slide down now. Katie? Thank you. All right, so let me hit some of the key themes. The first theme, obviously, from the title is that we are transitioning to a third nuclear age. The first nuclear age, obviously, was the bipolar Cold War standoff in which the United States pursued a mutual deterrence strategy with the Soviet Union or against the Soviet Union. Second was the unipolar post-Cold War era in which the United States enjoyed unrivaled conventional dominance, which led to a shift to a denuclearization strategy, entailing muscular nonproliferation and incremental reductions in legacy nuclear forces between Washington and Moscow. So first implementing the treaties that sort of tumbled out of the Cold War, INF and START 1, trying to negotiate a START 2, which never got ratified, but then following on with the Moscow Treaty and then the New START Treaty, which is the last treaty standing and still in place. And in the latter, for the New START, the context of that was President Obama's Nuclear Zero initiative, which really can be seen as the zenith of the denuclearization paradigm around the 2009-2010 timeframe. But we're now entering, as my title suggests, a third nuclear age. And I would say this third nuclear age began pretty specifically in 2014 when we had a series of events, including the Russian quasi-invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. You had the first allegations and discovery that Russia was cheating in a major way on the INF Treaty. And of course, on the China side, you had the beginning of the aggressive policy of island building, territorial claims in the South China Sea. And all of that has sort of accelerated. And so the third nuclear age is an age of multipolar, great power nuclear competition, centering on a core tripolar competition between Russia, China, and the United States, where each country is in a deterrence dyad with both of the others. But with France and Britain also in the mix, competing with Russia, and perhaps either now or in the future with China, India competing against China and Pakistan competing against India. One thing I would note in kind of laying all that out, that except for Pakistan, all of the secondary major nuclear powers are competing against either Russia or China. And I'll have something to say about that in a little while in terms of thinking about how a multipolar arms control process might or might not play out. The key takeaway is that, and it's sometimes easy to lose sight of this, but this takes us into wholly uncharted territory since the dawn of the nuclear revolution. The entire history of nuclear weapons, everything we think we know about nuclear weapons, deterrence, coercion, persuasion, assurance, etc., escalation risks, arms racing, everything we think we know about nuclear weapons, we know from the context of really a blink of history's eye, and in the context of two unusually stable periods of international relations: the bipolar Cold War stalemate, and then the unipolar Pax Americana of the post-Cold War world. So when it comes to nuclear multipolarity, we really have very little to guide us. And in a sense, to the extent we think we understand deterrence, to the extent we think we understand arms racing dynamics, those beliefs in our understanding may actually be more harmful than good, because they may give us a false sense of confidence that we understand what we're facing, when in fact it really is completely unprecedented. And I would argue that nuclear multipolarity is very worrisome for at least three interrelated reasons. Again, we have no idea how action-reaction dynamics of a multipolar arms race work. There's only been one nuclear arms race in history, and it was a very straightforward bipolar dyad. So we have no idea how those dynamics work. And I'll come back to this in a moment, because I have some suggestions about how we may start thinking about how those work. We also have no idea how a tripolar come multipolar deterrence stability works. We have this idea from the Cold War onward of strategic stability. We use different definitions of that. The Russians certainly have different definitions than us, but we all sort of understood what strategic stability sort of was about in a bilateral context. It was certainly about deterrence stability, crisis stability. Some might add arms racing stability, but we kind of understood what that was about. In a multipolar context, perhaps not so much. The great strategist, Professor Lawrence Friedman, famously equated deterrence to an old Western gun duel, where you had the two fighters, hair trigger, poised with their guns to draw, standing down. I would suggest that in the multipolar world, Professor Friedman's analogy needs to be updated. It's another Western analogy, but instead of the two gunfighters in a duel, it's that of the Mexican standoff, where you have multiple people with multiple people they're concerned about, all trying to keep watch on each other. It's a very different dynamic. Thirdly, none of the control instruments that were designed for the quiescent post-Cold War world, and right now that's everything we have essentially, other than the MPT, none of these were designed to handle this situation of a great power, multipolar, tripolar nuclear rivalry. And that includes New START. New START really is a child of that period of denuclearization, and it is the last guardrails we have, but it's not actually putting guardrails on the heart of the current competition. And in addition to that, it is likely to expire in a few years. And in my assessment, the chances of it being replaced with a new bilateral instrument are slight, exceeded only by the slightness of the chances of a new trilateral instrument. So we really do face the prospect that in just a few years' time, we will be facing the first uncontrolled nuclear arms race since 1972. So in sum, nuclear arms racing is back with a vengeance, but this will be a dangerously different kind of arms race. One key reason for this is that multipolarity introduces new dynamics. And let me focus on one of those dynamics that I call transregional arms racing. The Cold War bipolar arms race had a global dimension, and that was the strategic balance and the strategic competition with strategic level systems. It also had simultaneous and parallel regional arms races, centering primarily in Europe and secondarily in Asia, and focusing on sub-strategic systems, intermediate, medium, and down to the tactical. Today, we are seeing the reemergence of both strategic competition and regional competition. But now the regional competition is centering equally on Europe and Asia is almost certainly going to be moving to the fore currently and in the years ahead. So if you could pull up, please, slide number 3. So this is just a very simple diagram of today's nuclear dyads. You can see you have Russia, China, and the United States in what some have called the Big Triangle, within Britain and France, currently thought to be focusing solely on Russia, although targeting is, of course, not something in the public domain, so that is just a conjecture, and India focusing currently only on China. But even with this relatively simple current situation, we're already seeing examples of transregional dynamics. So to give you just one obvious example, China builds up a very formidable force of intermediate range nuclear missiles, which are dual capable, conventional or nuclear. And a large part of that is China trying to implement a anti-access aerial denial strategy against the United States and its allies in Asia. So in many ways, there's a plausible case to be made that China's formidable intermediate range missile force is really a regional force aimed at the United States and China. But of course, it provokes a strong reaction from Russia. And remember, it was President Putin who began saying that Russia would need to pull out of the INF Treaty unless it was expanded to include other countries. And he explained that it really wasn't reasonable for Russia and the United States to be the only countries without such systems when other countries within range of Russia had them. So he didn't actually use the word China. He meant China. And in fact, as things unwound, Russia did, in fact, deploy weapons against the rules of INF, leading the Trump administration to pull out of INF. And so here we are. The point is that really there's a case to be made that what we were seeing was a trans-regional action reaction, where something China was doing to counter the US and its allies in Asia led to Russia doing something that now has NATO and the US very concerned about Russian intermediate range missile forces. These trans-regional dynamics, I would argue, could multiply if multipolar arms racing in conjunction with regional proliferation, think Iran, provokes new nuclear entrants. And we're in a situation now, almost unprecedented, even a decade ago, where a number of countries, including a number of US allies, are having private discussions within their strategic circles about whether they may need at some point to go nuclear themselves if we have this newly envenomed nuclear environment. Next slide, please. So what might that look like? Here I'm suggesting the countries who would be most likely to become nuclear entrants, and essentially that would be additional countries in Asia in response to China and or North Korea, or additional countries in the Middle East in response to Iran. And what this does is it creates a web of dyads that crisscrosses and transects regions. And it doesn't take much to see how this could have a profound impact on not only deterrence, but arms racing dynamics. So for example, if Japan was to take some action and China were to respond to it, or do it the other way around. China were to take some action that finally pushes Japan to go from being a nuclear hedger to quickly becoming a fairly robust nuclear power. China takes counteractions and whatnot. The point is, there is no way that if this happened, that Russia and India and the United States would not all become somewhat alarmed if China was taking some action. This would then spill over, just with Russia being alarmed. This would spill over to Turkey, who would be in a competitive dyad with Russia. With the United States, this would spill over to Iran, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, nothing could really happen, certainly not among the big three, but conceivably almost with any of the major nuclear powers in this situation that would not have ripple effects and spillover effects across this whole web of dyads. You take that slide down, please. So I would argue that these transregional dynamics are one thing we can anticipate. And there's an interactive feature of these because, again, part of this is going to depend on whether we have new entrants, and part of that is going to depend on whether we can keep the lid on proliferation with regional entrants such as Iran or North Korea really moving to the next step that could provoke regional proliferation. It's going to also depend on whether we can get guardrails on the Russian, Chinese, and American competition. And finally, it's going to depend on whether U.S. allies continue to have confidence in U.S. extended deterrence guarantees and that long-standing bargain that basically says you don't need your own nuclear weapons despite the nuclear threats out there because you can rely on us. And all of those things, I think, are really somewhat in question. So when I started writing this book about 2.5 years ago, the idea that we were in the nascent stages of a new nuclear arms race was pretty controversial. As it's released this week, the idea is almost cliche, but let me just sort of reiterate very quickly where we are. Every existing nuclear power is currently modernizing and expanding their nuclear forces to some degree. Russia has been the focus of this with significant new systems such as the monster new Satan II ICBM, which will be the heaviest ICBM in history. Russian television is very happy to tout the fact that a single missile will be able to carry enough MIRVs of sufficient yield to completely obliterate either the state of Texas or the country of France. In addition to that, President Putin has gone out of his way to tout his exotic doomsday weapons, like the nuclear-powered and armed cruise missile and autonomous torpedo. And in recent weeks, the public has become aware that China may in fact be sprinting towards some version of nuclear parity. Some even suggest nuclear superiority, as we're seeing evidence that China is moving into a large ICBM deployment. So that is an arms race by any measure. However, this is more than a numerical arms race. It's a technological arms race. And it centers on new delivery systems, in particular maneuverable hypersonic missiles and defenses against those systems. And right now, in terms of arms racing, the most visible area of this is the hypersonic arms race. The race is on for hypersonics at all ranges and defenses against them. Right now, we are saying ours will not be nuclear armed. Russia is saying theirs will. China is not saying. The chances that Russia would arm hypersonics as strategic to intermediate level to medium range nuclear delivery systems and not have a response seems incredible to me. So we have this hypersonic race on, and a hypersonic defense race is on. The good news is that at least in this respect, Washington is in the hunt and not too far behind, and perhaps even in a position to pull ahead. The same can't be said for the rest of the nuclear balance. The U.S. is now at the very start of modernizing its obsolescent nuclear triad and legacy sub-strategic systems. So it is already behind Russia quantitatively and qualitatively, as Russia is nearing the completion of a modernization cycle. Although Russia has disadvantages in terms of needing to continue, excuse me, in terms of needing to continue to produce new systems and in terms of whether it will have the economic wherewithal to maintain that in the long run. But nonetheless, Russia is very much in the lead now. And again, as I mentioned, we could be conceivably in a situation where China may be positioned to leapfrog us. So this may be painting an alarmist picture, but I would argue there's pretty good reason for alarm. All of which brings us to the question of what is to be done. So my core thesis is that we need to look back at the Cold War paradigm of adversarial, deterrent-centric arms control, rather than relying on our current paradigm, which is essentially to rely on nonproliferation and making bilateral reductions, what I've referred to as a denuclearization paradigm. In a sense, I'm arguing that today's geostrategic nuclear landscape looks a lot more like 1959 than 2009. How so? Then Washington was facing the imminent prospect of losing strategic dominance as Moscow closed in on becoming a peer strategic rival, just as today we are facing the rise of China and the resurgence, at least for the short term, of Russia. Then nuclear competition was unfettered by guardrails, the sorts of guardrails we've gotten very used to, the sorts of transparency we've gotten very used to. And it's likely that soon that will be the case again with the demise of INF and the respective expiry of New START. We may not only be in a situation where we will have no controls and predictability, but where we will have no transparency for the first time in decades. Then the focus was on game-changing counterforce systems coming online. First, missiles, ICBMs, and SLBMs, followed rapidly by MIRVs. And those were driving an action-reaction scramble to deploy such systems, to deploy them in equal numbers, and of course, to defend against them. And that is all playing out and happening again today, I would argue. With hypersonics, I would actually say that hypersonics, we are not thinking of them as strategic delivery vehicles. Others are. If you think of hypersonics as strategic delivery vehicles, I would argue that the hypersonic revolution could be as destabilizing to deterrence as MIRVs were, probably more so. And if you look at the focus during the Cold War on Russian heavy SS-18s and their ability to carry more MIRVs than equivalent U.S. systems, I believe that the Sarmat 2, the Satan 2, that is clearly being outfitted, and the Russians have said it's being outfitted as a multi-hypersonic delivery system, and it will certainly be able to deliver more hypersonics than any other system. Then the Soviet Union was deeply unserious about arms control, really viewed disarmament as a propaganda exercise, and utterly unwilling to countenance any intrusive verification, just as China is today on all counts. And finally, then, within U.S. strategic circles, hawks were thinking in traditional military terms, arguing for strategic superiority. And doves were thinking in moral terms, arguing for nuclear abolition, with neither side really focusing on more pragmatic issues of stable mutual deterrence or mutual assured destruction, strategic stability. Just as I would argue, and I do argue, deterrence has fallen out of favor on both the hawkish right and the dovish left today. So in the interests of time, I will not go into my detailed analysis of the divergent incentives for Washington, Russia, China, and others, what they may be looking for from an arms control negotiation if we ever got that process going, what the countervailing negotiating leverages and incentives would be, although I cover that in extensive detail in a chapter of the book. But let me do offer up at least some key principles as takeaways from the Cold War theory and practice of arms control, principles that I believe are going to be essential if we're going to invent a new arms control for a new third nuclear age. These are pretty simple. None of them are particularly original, but I believe they're principles that our strategic dialogue has lost sight of. We have gotten too used to a denuclearization paradigm, and we've gotten too used to thinking that it is either broad multilateral disarmament like CTBT or whatnot that's done over in the Conference on Disarmament, or it's nonproliferation, or it's US-Russia. And none of those are quite right, and none of the principles that fit that are going to really be good fits. So what are the principles, these simple principles? First of all, keep negotiations as small and private as possible. So this suggests starting with a tripolar process, or at most a plurilateral process, including at most France, Britain, and India. Bilateral is too narrow, and multilateral is too broad in our new world. I would argue for a tripolar process, but the fact of the matter is that Russia may, for understandable reasons, insist that France and Britain be part of it, and China may, for understandable reasons, insist that India be part of it. So we may really have no option but to make it a multilateral process, or really more accurately, a plurilateral process. But I think our approach should be trilateral, and expanding it into a plurilateral process might be a concession we need to make, or something to look at. Two, we need to, and this is perhaps my most controversial point, we need to embrace a two-track strategy. In other words, arms racing towards arms control. I would argue that that is what eventually led to the successes of Cold War arms control, certainly the INF Treaty and the START I Treaty. It also was what led to an ability to achieve a bipartisan consensus, where you had doves who weren't really keen on the arms racing part, but were glad we were trying to genuinely get arms control to do something about this, and hawks that weren't really too keen on the arms control part, but were glad that at least arms control acknowledged that you needed to have leverage, you needed to negotiate from a position of equality, or at least not too much of weakness, if not from strength. And more important, arms control theory was all about embracing stable mutual deterrence, and stable mutual deterrence required at least a rough strategic balance. And therefore, if you were not modernizing, if you were not tit for tatting, you were at risk of losing a strategic balance, and that was seen by arms control to be negative. We need to get back to that way of thinking, and that is going to have hawks and doves each flapping their feathers with displeasure, and I acknowledge that. But my point is that if we are serious about trying to get the Russians and the Chinese to the negotiating table, we are going to need to demonstrate to them that doing so is in their interest, and the only way to do that is to convince them that not doing so will lead us to compete with them. Next, start small and incremental, including tailoring proposals for what can be verified. Russia, through most of, or the Soviets, through most of the Cold War experience, were absolutely allergic to any intrusive verification. And until the INF talks at the very end of the process, would not concede any verification. China is now in the position of being absolutely resistant to any arms control at all, but for sure would resist any verification, and in fact is unwilling to be even minimally transparent about its nuclear programs. So the upshot of that is any initial focus is probably going to start small, just as happened in the Cold War. And even if we ever move to a more robust negotiating process, it's probably going to look a lot more like SALT 1, focusing on launchers and meaning silos and subs, rather than START 1, focusing on the missiles that carry warheads, never mind New START, focusing not only on the missiles, but on the number of deployed warheads. So we really, I think, with China in that equation, are going to need to go back to basics and be doing some very rudimentary approaches and starting small in order to hopefully move forward. That brings me to the penultimate principle, and that is prepare for the long haul. China's not coming around in a year or two or 3 or 4. China is not going to come around until and unless it believes that we are serious about competing. And the real takeaway from this is that we need a durable bipartisan consensus, both for competing in this arms race and for negotiating controls on it. We cannot get into this third nuclear age with partisan shifts with every turn of administration and with every change of Congress. We need to find a bipartisan consensus on nuclear policy. Unless we do, these shifts are going to be seen as unreliable by our allies and as opportunities by our adversaries. Finally, we should not be afraid to make reasonable proposals, even knowing that they will be rejected. And again, I offer a number of suggestions in the book along these lines. Doing so points to how arms control could be useful, and if we are making reasonable and plausible proposals, it puts pressure on Russia and China to respond or face international pressure for failing to do so. Even a wildly unreasonable counterproposal is how you start a process. And at this point, getting China to belly up to the arms control table, at least to the point of explaining what's wrong with this or that US proposal and making counter proposals, would be a first step. Every nuclear arms control treaty that has ever been signed, ratified, and implemented has started with a proposal that was rejected out of hand. So I'm looking at the time. Why don't I stop there on that uncharacteristically optimistic note and see if I have at least provoked some questions, or if not, at least some outrage comments. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for a very interesting, thought-provoking presentation, and I particularly value the fact that it begins with first principles and high-level strategic concepts rather than way down in the weeds on the instrumentalities and bean counting. So well done.